The other night we were sitting around the dinner table and I was talking with my wife and all the kids are sitting around the table and I used one of those words that we are trying to get our 3-year-old to not say. Certainly wasn't a bad word, nothing wrong with it, a word we would normally use on a regular basis, but we've been working to get him to not use this word as a 3-year-old in particular. Circumstances, he doesn't understand it. And so I'm talking and I say this word, and as soon as I say it, I think, oh no. And I turn to him and I say, you don't say that word. And of course, what does he do? He begins repeating it over and over again. And my wife rolls her eyes at me and I'm like, well, I told him not to say it, right? But we all know that that doesn't have the impact that hearing daddy say the word has. And so that example that I set for him was much more powerful than my instruction to not say something that he had just seen daddy say. Fortunately for us, example is a powerful tool to get us to behave in certain ways. And Jesus left us an example that isn't going to lead us astray like my example might. It is an example that is going to be very positive for us. Peter talks about one very interesting portion of this example, maybe one that we overlook. It talks about Jesus' example and how to handle suffering. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he says, you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you. And here it is, leaving an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. And we see several pieces here of Jesus' example for us and how we ought to handle suffering. And first of all, it's understanding that suffering for God's sake is a calling. Jesus knew that he had been called for a purpose, and he gave us that example to say, when you suffer, understand that this is a special calling that God has placed on your life. It changes the perspective of suffering immensely, doesn't it? If I think, on one hand, this is something I shouldn't be going through, this is something that is wrong for me, this is something I need to get out of as fast as possible. Or on the other hand, I say, this is God's special calling in my life. It elevates that suffering to a divine place rather than a miserable physical place. And so we understand that we've been called to this purpose. We also understand that sometimes suffering is not just circumstantial, it's other people mistreating us. And he gives us an example for that, because that's certainly the suffering Jesus faced. He didn't return evil for evil. Jesus gives us an example that when others mistreat us, we cannot mistreat them in return. That might be our instinct, that might be what we want to do, but we have to quietly and calmly accept the mistreatment, remove ourselves if that's possible. I'm not saying always endure abuse, particularly if it is not for the sake of Christ, which is what Jesus was dealing with. He could not remove himself from that abuse, because that would have been a violation on his part of God's will for him. But if you can certainly remove yourself from the mistreatment. But if not, we quietly accept it, trusting God. And that's the other example Jesus gives us. He trusted his Father completely, and we must as well. Whenever I'm facing suffering, whether it's circumstantial, whether it's somebody mistreating me, I have to trust my Father that he's in control. He's the one that will eventually take care of those who are hurting me. If someone is mistreating me and I am just doing the right thing, then I have to understand one day they're going to get theirs. It's not my job to make them get theirs, but God will take care of that one day somehow, and it's not my job to worry about that. One other aspect of his example for us is that Jesus suffered in such a way that he focused on bringing healing to those around him. And so I think that even when I'm going through a hard time, I can look around and find out if there are others that I can help in trying to understand what they're going through and help provide healing for others. So sometimes when we're going through suffering, when we're going through trials and difficulties, we feel alone, but we're certainly not alone. We're not even alone in this life because many people around us are suffering as well. But you're certainly not alone because your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, probably suffered something greater than what you're going through, but he suffered just like you. He endured it in a way that honored his Father, and he left you an example so that you can follow in his footsteps.